The dust of the auction yard tasted like failure. It was a fine, gritty powder that settled on your tongue and in the back of your throat, a compound of dry topsoil, crushed gravel, and desperation. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, arms crossed over his chest, his knuckles thick and scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron. It was August of '73, and the air was thick with the promise of a bumper crop and the buzz of easy money. The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic, rhythmic drone, punctuated by the sharp crack of the gavel. They were selling off the old Miller place, 160 acres of prime bottomland that bordered Silas's own farm. Old Man Miller had finally given up the ghost, and his kids, scattered to the cities like dandelion seeds, wanted cash, not land. Silas had come with a number in his head, a hard number, the sum total of 3 good years of savings tucked away in a coffee can. It wasn't much, but it was his. It wasn't the bank's. "I got 200 an acre. Who'll give me 2 1/4? 2 1/4. Now 3. Now 3. Can I get 300? The auctioneer rattled, his face slick with sweat under the brim of his straw hat. Silas watched Dale Bishop raise his bidder card. Dale was young, barely 30, with a soft face that hadn't seen enough hardship and a swagger that said he thought he'd never have to. He was the new breed of farmer, the kind who talked about leverage and cash flow, who saw the local production credit association banker more than he saw his own pastor. He was already farming 1,000 acres, all of it on borrowed money, all of it with brand new, shiny red International Harvester equipment. 300 an acre from Mr. Bishop. Now 3 1/4, 3 1/4. Come on, boys, they ain't making any more of it. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his gut. He knew his number was already dust in the wind. He could see the banker, a man named Henderson with a tie that was always too tight, standing behind Dale, giving him a confident nod. It wasn't a fair fight. It was Silas's coffee can against the full faith and credit of the United States banking system. The bidding climbed, relentless and dizzying, $400, $500, $600 an acre. The crowd murmured. That was unheard of money for land in this part of the county. But the papers were full of stories about the Russians buying up all the grain, and the price of corn was heading for the moon. Optimism was a fever, and Dale Bishop was burning with it. 650, do I hear 7? 675 from Bishop, now 700. Silas slowly uncrossed his arms and shoved his hands into the pockets of his worn overalls. He could feel the smooth, cool metal of a half-inch wrench he'd forgotten was there. He looked past the crowd, past the auctioneer's stand, to the field beyond. The corn stood tall and proud, the tassels turning a golden brown. His corn, on his land, paid for by his father, and his father before him. No banker held a piece of paper on it. That thought was the only thing that kept the bitter taste in his mouth from turning to poison. Sold! For $725 an acre to Dale Bishop. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot, and a smattering of applause broke out. Dale turned, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. He caught Silas's eye and sauntered over, his new work boots barely scuffed. Henderson the banker followed like a pilot fish on a shark. "Tough break, Si," Dale said, though there was no sympathy in his voice. "Just couldn't keep up, huh?" Silas met his gaze. He could smell the cologne on Dale, a scent as out of place in the dusty auction yard as a tuxedo. "It's good land," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Hope you can make it pay." Dale laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Oh, I'll make it pay. Got a new 1466 on order. Should be here next week. We'll have that ground turned over and ready for beans before your old 4020 can even get warmed up." He gestured vaguely toward the road where Silas's faded green John Deere pickup was parked. "You know, Si, There's no shame in modernizing. The bank's handing out money. You could trade in that old junk heap of a combine you run and get something that'll actually get the crop out before Christmas." Henderson cleared his throat. "Dale's right, Silas. We're offering very favorable terms right now. It's the time to expand. Get big or get out, you know." Silas just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Dale. He saw the future in Dale's confident smirk, a future of massive debt, of payments that had to be made whether the rain came or not, whether the prices were high or low. It was a future built on a piece of paper, a promise to a man in a tie. His own farm was built on something else: sweat, sacrifice, and the solid, unyielding reality of paid-for steel and soil. "I'll stick with what I've got," Silas said quietly. "It doesn't owe me anything, and I don't owe it anything. We're even." Dale just shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Suit yourself, old man. Don't come crying to me when that deer of yours finally rusts into the ground." He clapped Henderson on the back, and the two of them walked off toward the trailer to sign the papers, leaving Silas standing alone in the settling dust. He stayed there for a long time, watching them, feeling the sun beat down on his neck. He thought about his combine, the John Deere 95. It wasn't a junk heap. It was a 1968 model, the last year of the good ones before they started putting in too much wiring and not enough iron. He'd bought it used, but in good shape 5 years ago, paid cash. He knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every belt. He knew the particular groan it made when the cylinder was overloaded and the specific shudder it gave just before a belt was about to slip. It was a machine he understood, a machine he trusted. Dale saw rust and obsolescence. Silas saw reliability. He saw freedom. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. As you listen to this, think about your own life, or the lives of your parents or grandparents. Have you ever had to choose between the shiny and new, with a payment book, and the old and reliable that was paid in full? Whether it was a car, a house, or a piece of equipment, which path did you take? Let me know down in the comments what you think is the smarter choice, and why. I'm curious to hear what folks think about Silas's way of doing things. Silas finally turned and walked back to his truck. The drive home was quiet, the gravel road crunching under his tires. He passed the newly purchased Miller place, and he could already see Dale in his mind's eye, ripping through the fence rows with a big disc, tearing out the trees that had stood for 100 years, all to gain another couple of rows of soybeans. He pulled into his own lane, the tires rumbling over the cattle guard. His farm looked the same as it had yesterday. The white 2-story house, the big red barn with the fading chewing tobacco ad on the side, the neat rows of corn stretching toward the horizon. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The world was moving faster, getting bigger, and it was leaving him behind. Or so they all thought. He shut off the truck, the engine clattering to a halt, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, the weight of Dale's words settling on him like the auction dust. He had a harvest to bring in, and he'd do it with the machine he had. He'd show them all. The trouble started, as it always did, at the worst possible time. It was late October. A cold snap had descended on the county, and the corn was finally dry enough to shell. Silas had spent the last 2 weeks getting the 95 ready. He'd greased every fitting until the old grease pushed out, a ritual he performed with the devotion of a priest. He'd checked the tension on every chain and every belt, his calloused fingers reading the condition of the rubber and steel like a blind man reading Braille. He'd pulled the big concave, checked the cylinder bars for wear, and set the clearance just right. The old 239 diesel engine had fired right up, settling into its familiar, throaty rumble. It was ready. He was ready. He'd been in the field for 3 days, working from sunup until the dew got too heavy after dark. The old combine was performing beautifully, a steady, rhythmic beast chewing its way through the rows. The sound was a symphony to him, the roar of the diesel, the whir of the straw walkers, the satisfying clatter of shelled corn hitting the grain tank. He was making good time, filling the old grain truck twice a day, hauling it to the bin site himself. From the cab of the 95, he could see across the valley to where Dale Bishop was running. Dale had 2 machines going now, a brand new Gleaner L2 and that big international axial flow. They ran day and night, their powerful halogen lights cutting through the darkness like alien spacecraft, serviced by a fleet of grain carts and semi-trucks. It was an impressive operation, a factory in the field. Silas's one-man, one combine, one truck show felt small and slow by comparison. On the 4th day, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but the wind had a bite to it, a promise of the winter to come. He was on his last pass of the 80-acre field by the creek when he heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, it was a subtle change in the machine's song, a harmony that had turned to discord, a low, grinding growl that vibrated up through the steering column and into the palms of his hands. Silas immediately throttled down the diesel and disengaged the separator. The grinding lessened, but didn't stop. It was coming from the guts of the machine, deep in the main separator drive. He shut the whole thing down, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry corn stalks. He climbed down from the cab, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. The smell of hot metal and burnt grease hung in the air. He pulled open the side shields, his heart sinking with each bolt he turned. He knew, even before he saw it, that it was bad. The main variable speed sheave for the cylinder drive was glowing cherry red. The bearing behind it had failed, completely disintegrated. Hot, molten grease had sprayed across the inside of the machine like black lava. The sheave itself was warped and scored, utterly destroyed. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the ruin. This wasn't a simple fix. This wasn't a belt you could just replace. This was a catastrophic failure of a core component. The machine was dead in the water, and he had over 200 acres of corn still standing in the field. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to get the drive apart. The heat from the failed bearing had fused the sheave to the main shaft. He put a 3-foot pipe wrench on it, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. It wouldn't budge. He got his cutting torch from the shop, the singing hiss of the acetylene filling the quiet field as he carefully tried to heat the hub without damaging the shaft. Still nothing. It was seized solid. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a set of headlights appeared at the end of the field. It was Dale Bishop in his shiny new Ford pickup. He pulled up alongside the crippled combine, rolled down the electric window, and leaned out. "Having some trouble, Si?" he asked, the same mocking pity in his voice as at the auction. "Bearing went out," Silas said, not looking at him, wiping a smear of black grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Yeah, they tend to do that on these old relics," Dale said. He took a long, slow look at the combine, then at the vast expanse of unharvested corn. "Look, I'm almost done with my beans. I could probably bring one of my machines over here in a couple days and knock this out for you. For a price, of course, a friendly neighbor rate." The offer was coated in condescension. Dale didn't want to help. He wanted to prove his point. He wanted Silas to admit defeat, to concede that his old ways were finished. "I'll manage," Silas said, through gritted teeth. Dale shrugged. "Suit yourself. But that north wind feels like snow. Be a shame to see a good crop buried till spring. He gunned his engine, the powerful V8 roaring to life, and drove off, leaving Silas alone in the growing dark with his broken machine. The scorn was worse than the breakdown. The next day at the parts store in town, the man behind the counter, who'd known Silas for 30 years, just shook his head. A variable speed sheave for a 6895? Silas, they haven't made that part in 10 years. You'd be lucky to find one in a salvage yard. At the grain co-op, a few other farmers were gathered around the coffee pot. Heard your combines gave up the ghost, Si, one of them said. She's just resting, Silas replied, trying to keep his voice even. You ought to just junk that thing and get a real machine, another one chimed in. Dale Bishop's running 2 new ones. They say he's going to clear 5,000 acres this year. The word stung. They saw him as a stubborn old fool, a relic clinging to a bygone era while the rest of the world marched forward. He spent the next 2 days driving across 3 counties, visiting every tractor salvage yard he knew. He walked through graveyards of rusted machinery, looking for the telltale green and yellow of a fallen deer. He found a dozen 95s, but all of them had been picked clean, their variable speed drives long since sold or seized up just like his. He returned home empty-handed, the weight of failure pressing down on him. His wife, Martha, met him at the door, her face etched with worry. She didn't say anything, just handed him a hot cup of coffee. He drank it, standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the fields. The corn stood there, waiting, mocking him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the wind howling around the corners of the old farmhouse, and for the first time in his life, Silas Blackwood felt the cold dread of defeat. He was beaten. Dale was right. The world had passed him by. The boom years hit the farm belt like a shot of adrenaline. It started right after the big Russian grain deal in '72 and just kept rolling. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.50 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly shot past $3, then flirted with $4. Soybeans were even crazier. Land that had sold for $700 an acre at the Miller auction was now being appraised for $2,000, then $2,500. It was a gold rush, and the fuel for it wasn't diesel, it was debt. Dale Bishop became the poster child for the new prosperity. With the soaring value of his land as collateral, the bank in town couldn't push money at him fast enough. He bought another 300 acres from a retiring farmer, paying a price that made the old-timers gasp. He traded in his year-old International 1466 for a brand-new 1586, a 4-wheel drive monster with duals all around and a stereo in the cab. He replaced the Gleaner L2 with a top-of-the-line N6, a rotary machine that could swallow 8 rows of corn at a time and barely grunt. His operation was a sight to behold. A massive new machine shed went up, big enough to hold all his new toys. A new grain leg and a set of 50,000 bushel bins rose against the skyline, dwarfing Silas's modest collection of old butler bins. Dale's wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and they broke ground on a sprawling brick ranch house on a hill overlooking their empire. At the co-op, Dale held court, talking about hedging on the futures market and tax depreciation strategies. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an agribusinessman, and the other farmers, especially the younger ones, hung on his every word. Meanwhile, Silas kept on. That fall after the breakdown, he'd finally found the part he needed. It was in a small, forgotten salvage yard in southern Illinois, on a combine that had been wrecked in a fire. The part was scorched but intact. It cost him 2 days of driving and $150 he couldn't really spare. But when he got back, He worked through the night under the glare of a single trouble light, his hands raw and bleeding, until the 95 was whole again. He got his crop out, weeks behind schedule, but he got it out. Through the mid-70s, as Dale's empire grew, Silas's farm remained stubbornly the same size. The high grain prices were good to him too. He was comfortable. He replaced the roof on the barn, bought Martha a new Maytag washing machine so she wouldn't have to fight with the old wringer washer anymore, and he put a healthy sum into his savings account at the bank. But he didn't borrow. He didn't expand. When the 80 acres next to his north field came up for sale, he let it go. Dale Bishop snapped it up without even blinking. The whispers in the community grew louder. Silas Blackwood was a fool. He was sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. He was letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by out of sheer stubbornness. Dale even approached him one day at the feed store. "See," he'd said, his tone a mixture of pity and arrogance. "I'm putting together a big parcel on your northern border. Your place fits right in the middle. I'll make you a fair offer, cash. More money than you've ever seen. You could retire, move to Florida, play golf." "I'm not a golfer, Dale," Silas had replied, hoisting a bag of feed onto his shoulder. "And this land isn't for sale. You're missing the boat, Si. This is never going to happen again. You've got to take advantage of it." "My father always said, 'The land remembers who owes the bank,'" Silas said, looking Dale square in the eye. "When prices are high, they'll give you an umbrella. The minute it starts to rain, they'll ask for it back." Dale had just laughed and shaken his head as Silas walked away. The pressure was immense, a constant, grinding force. Even Martha, his steady, quiet partner, began to show the strain. "Are we doing the right thing, Si?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch swing, listening to the crickets. "Everyone else is getting ahead. The Bishops have that new house. Their kids have new clothes for school every year." Silas looked out at his fields, dark and silent under a canopy of stars. "We have everything we need, Martha, and it's all ours. That house isn't Dale's, it's the bank's. That new combine isn't his, it's International Harvesters Credit Corporation's. We sleep at night." I wonder if he does. But even as he said the words, a sliver of doubt pricked at him. Was he just a stubborn old man, afraid of change? Was he letting his father's Depression-era fears cripple his own future? He watched the headlights of Dale's massive tractors working late into the night on the horizon and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a feeling of being left behind, of watching a train pull out of the station while he stood on the platform, holding a ticket for a different destination entirely. The fall of 1978 was the peak. Corn hit an all-time high, and the harvest was a bin-buster. Everyone was flush with cash and giddy with success. The talk at the diner was of buying more land, more equipment. The future seemed limitless, but Silas felt a change in the wind. It was subtle, something you couldn't quite put your finger on. The banker, Henderson, who had always been so eager to lend, now had a strained look in his eyes. On the radio, the national news started talking about inflation, a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, and something called the prime interest rate. The words were just noise to most of the farmers, who were busy planning their winter vacations to Hawaii. One crisp November afternoon, Silas was in his machine shed, changing the oil on the 4020. The air was cold and smelled of diesel and damp earth. He had the big drain pan under the tractor, the warm black oil trickling out in a steady stream. Through the open shed door, he could see his fields, harvested and resting under a blanket of chopped stalks. The John Deere 95 sat in the corner, cleaned and serviced, ready for its long winter sleep. He felt a sense of peace, of completion. His work was done. His bins were full. He owed no man a dime. Just then, a sleek Lincoln Continental pulled into his yard. It was Henderson, the banker. He got out of the car, his city shoes crunching on the gravel. He looked uncomfortable, out of place. "Silas," he said, forcing a smile. "Just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by." "What can I do for you, Mr. Henderson?" Silas asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, I was just reviewing our accounts," Henderson began, his eyes darting around the old shed, at the well-maintained but ancient equipment. "And I see you've had another good year. Built up quite a nice nest egg in your savings." "The Lord's been good to us," Silas said. He has, Henderson agreed quickly. "But, Silas, money sitting in a savings account is lazy money. With land values the way they are, you could leverage that. We could put together a package for you, get you into a new line of equipment, maybe pick up that quarter section east of you. It's for sale, you know. Dale Bishop is looking at it, but we'd rather see a man like you have it." Silas looked at the banker, the forced smile, the sweat on his upper lip despite the cold. The desperation was rolling off him in waves. He wasn't trying to help Silas. He was trying to get more loans on the books, to keep the pyramid scheme going just a little bit longer. He needed Silas's solid, debt-free operation to balance out the massive, risky loans he'd given to men like Dale Bishop. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Henderson," Silas said slowly, his voice flat and steady. "But I'm happy with what I've got." Henderson's face fell. "Silas, you have to understand, these opportunities—" "I understand just fine," Silas cut him off. He tossed the oily rag onto his workbench. "I understand that interest rates are climbing. I hear it on the radio. And I understand that my savings account is insured by the government. Can you say the same about Dale Bishop's land?" The banker paled. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. There was nothing to say. He knew that Silas knew. The party was almost over. Henderson mumbled a goodbye and practically ran to his car. Silas watched him drive away, a plume of dust chasing the big Lincoln down the lane. He turned and looked back at his old combine. It sat there, silent and patient, its green paint faded, a few dings and rust spots on its sheet metal. To everyone else, it was a relic, an antique. But to Silas, it looked like the safest thing in the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind shifted, blowing hard out of the northwest. It was a cold wind, a bitter wind, and it carried the unmistakable scent of snow. The foreclosure winter of '79 was on its way. The first sign of the coming storm was not in the sky, but on the radio. In January of 1980, the president announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The news crackled from the small transistor radio on Silas's workbench, a tinny voice delivering a death sentence to the booming market. Within a week, the price of corn at the local co-op fell 50 cents a bushel. By spring planting, it had dropped a full $1. The fever of the '70s had broken, and a cold sweat was setting in. Dale Bishop, who had leveraged his entire operation on $3 corn, just laughed it off. "It's a temporary dip," he'd proclaimed over coffee at the diner. "Politics. It'll blow over. The world's got to eat." He went ahead and planted fence row to fence row, just as he always had, financing his spring operating loan at a staggering 12% interest, convinced the market would rebound by fall. Silas, however, felt a deep unease. He'd seen this before, in smaller cycles. He knew that markets had no memory and no loyalty. He planted his usual acreage, using seed he'd saved from the previous year's crop and fertilizer he'd paid for, with cash back in the fall when the prices were lower. His costs were a fraction of Dale's, but even so, the numbers looked grim. The summer was a cruel one, A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest in July and refused to leave. The sky turned a hazy, bleached-out white, and the sun beat down with a merciless intensity. The corn, which had looked so promising in June, began to suffer. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, their color fading from a deep, healthy green to a dusty olive. The creek that bordered Silas's bottomland dwindled to a trickle, then disappeared altogether, leaving behind a cracked, grey mosaic of mud. Silas watched his crop wither and could do nothing. He had no irrigation, no way to fight the sky. But his land, farmed carefully for generations, held the moisture better than Dale's. Silas's father had taught him about building up the soil, about leaving residue on the surface to act as a mulch. Dale's land, which had been ploughed deep and clean with massive moldboard ploughs every fall to hide the trash and impress the banker, was as hard and dry as a brick. The rain, when it finally came in late August, was a deluge. It hit the baked earth and ran off in brown torrents, carrying Dale's precious topsoil with it, cutting deep gullies into his fields. Silas's land, protected by its blanket of old stalks, drank the water in. Harvest that year was a somber affair. The yields were down by a third across the county. The price was still in the basement. And a new terror had emerged. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve had declared war on inflation, and the prime interest rate was climbing like a rocket. Those operating loans taken out at 12% were now being renewed at 15, then 17. One afternoon in early November, Silas was working his way through a patch of corn that had been hit hardest by the drought. The stalks were short, the ears small and poorly filled. The old John Deere 95 just rumbled along, taking what it was given. As he came to the end of a row, he saw trouble across the fence line. Dale's massive Gleaner N6 rotary combine was sitting silent in the middle of the field. A white service truck from the dealership in the city was parked beside it. Silas finished his pass and shut his machine down. He climbed down and walked over to the fence. Dale was there, arguing with the mechanic, his face red with frustration. "What do you mean you can't get the part?" Dale was shouting. "It's a brand new machine. I just made a $20,000 payment on it." "The main hydraulic pump is shot, Mr. Bishop," the mechanic said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He was a young kid, no older than Silas's own son. "It's a sealed unit. We don't have one in stock. The whole country's screaming for 'em. There's a strike at the factory in Illinois. It could be 2 weeks. It could be a month." "A month?" Dale's voice cracked. "I've got 2,000 acres left to cut. It'll be snowing in a month." "I'm sorry, sir. There's nothing I can do." The mechanic packed up his tools, his face a mask of weary indifference. He'd probably had the same conversation a dozen times that week. Dale kicked the giant rear tire of the combine, a futile act of rage against the unfeeling steel. He saw Silas standing at the fence. For a moment, his face hardened with the old arrogance, but it quickly crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked despair. "Can you believe this junk?" he spat. $150,000 machine, and it's dead in the water because of one stupid part. "Tough break," Silas said, and this time he meant it. He knew the sickening feeling of a breakdown in the middle of harvest. "Tough break doesn't even cover it," Dale muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Henderson called from the bank this morning. The interest on my operating loan went up again. 20%. He wants another payment by the 1st of the month. I can't make a payment if I can't get the crop out." He stared at his silent, crippled machine, then looked over at Silas's old 95, which sat there patiently, covered in the dust of the field, its engine still warm. It looked small and ancient next to the Gleaner, like a draft horse next to a racehorse, but the draft horse was still standing. "How do you do it, Si?" Dale asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you keep that old thing running?" "I know her," Silas said simply. "Every bolt, every belt, and she's paid for, makes a difference." Dale just shook his head and looked out at his endless rows of unharvested corn. The wind was picking up, rattling the dry leaves. It was a cold wind, and it carried the smell of winter and of failure. The first cracks in the empire were showing, and they were spreading fast. The winter of 81 was not a season, it was a siege. The price of corn refused to budge, pinned to the floor by the embargo and a worldwide surplus. Meanwhile, the prime interest rate hit a soul-crushing 21.5%. The number was an abstraction on the nightly news, but in the county it was a guillotine. Variable rate loans, the very tool that had fueled the boom, became instruments of execution. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to buy land and machinery saw their payments double, then triple, even as their income was cut in half. The community began to fray at the seams. The easy camaraderie at the co-op was replaced by a tense, hunted silence. Men who had known each other their whole lives now avoided eye contact, ashamed of their shared predicament. The Production Credit Association, once a friendly partner, became an adversary. Loan officers who had once taken farmers out for lunch were now serving foreclosure notices. Auction notices started appearing in the weekly paper like obituaries. First, it was the younger, most over-leveraged farmers. Their shiny, nearly new equipment was lined up in muddy farmyards, tagged and numbered, sold off to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. Each auction was a grim spectacle, attended by neighbors who came not to buy, but to bear witness, a silent chorus to a Greek tragedy. They stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim, watching another family's dream be dismantled piece by piece. They all knew they could be next. Dale Bishop fought it as long as he could. He sold off a parcel of land he'd bought just a few years earlier, taking a catastrophic loss. He let go of his hired man. His wife started working as a clerk at the grocery store in town. The sprawling brick ranch house they'd been building sat half-finished, a monument to a future that would never arrive, its windows boarded up against the winter wind. The final blow came in March. Silas was in town at the courthouse, recording a deed for a small timber lot he'd bought when he saw the notice pinned to the public bulletin board. It was a standard legal form, filled out in stark black type. A sheriff's sale. The defendant, Dale, and Sarah Bishop, the plaintiff, the First National Bank of Locust County. They were selling everything. The land, the equipment, the house, the entire empire, liquidated to satisfy the debt. Silas stood there and read the list of equipment: the International 1586 four-wheel drive, the Gleaner N6 rotary combine, the Kinsey planter, the semis, the grain bins. It was a catalogue of the very best, the most modern farming had to offer, and it was all being sold off like scrap. He felt a profound sadness. It wasn't triumph, it was the sorrow of watching a terrible, inevitable crash you'd seen coming from miles away. He saw Dale a few days later, coming out of the bank. It was a raw, grey afternoon, with a freezing drizzle that coated everything in a thin layer of ice. Dale looked like a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out. He wore an old, worn-out jacket, a stark contrast to the tailored coats he used to favor. Silas was across the street, heading into the hardware store. Their eyes met for a brief second. Dale looked away first, a flicker of shame and humiliation crossing his face. He pulled up his collar and hurried down the street, disappearing into the cold mist. That spring, Silas farmed his land, as he always had. He fired up the old 40 20, its diesel engine catching with a familiar, comforting puff of black smoke. He hitched it to his old 6-row planter and went to work. The fields around him were a patchwork of activity and stillness. Some farms, like his, were being planted, but others, Dale's included, lay fallow, the brown stubble of last year's failed crop a testament to the financial ruin. The bank owned them now, and the bank didn't plant corn. Silas survived because his balance sheet was simple. His income was down, but his expenses were almost zero. His land was paid for. His machinery was paid for. His fuel costs were his biggest outlay, but he made every drop count, planning his fieldwork with an efficiency born of decades of practice. He didn't need to make a profit that year. He just needed to not lose money. While his neighbors were drowning in interest payments, Silas was treading water, his head held just above the surface by a lifetime of fiscal discipline. His old, debt-free machinery wasn't just a collection of tools. It was a life raft in a sea of red ink. He worked from dawn till dusk, the steady rhythm of the old tractor, a counterpoint to the chaos consuming the world around him. He was a relic, a stubborn old fool, and he was still standing. The day of the Bishop auction was cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. A bitter wind whipped across the yard, snapping the flags on the auctioneer's truck and forcing the crowd to huddle deep in their coats. It was the biggest sale the county had ever seen, and it seemed everyone was there. There were other farmers, their faces etched with a grim mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. There were implement dealers and scrap men circling the big machinery like vultures, and there were the bankers standing in a tight, somber group, their city suits looking thin and inadequate against the rural chill. Silas parked his old pickup down the road and walked in. He wasn't there to gloat or to pick over the bones. He felt a solemn duty to bear witness. He saw Dale standing near the half-finished house, his wife beside him, their arms linked as if to hold each other up. They looked like strangers at their own funeral. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop: wrenches, welders, air compressors, the tools of a life's work, sold off one by one for a few dollars. Then came the big machinery, the massive International 1586, which had been Dale's pride and joy, sold for less than half of what he owed on it. The Gleaner N6, the cause of so much grief, went for a song to a dealer from out of state. With each crack of the gavel, another piece of Dale's dream was pulverized into dust. Finally, they came to the land. The auctioneer, a man with a face like a worn saddle, described the parcels in a low, respectful tone. "Folks, we're now selling 160 acres, known locally as the Old Miller Place. Prime bottomland, some of the best soil in the county." It was the land that had started it all, the land Silas had tried to buy all those years ago. The bidding started low. The bankers looked nervous. In this economy, there was no guarantee they'd recoup their losses. A few tentative bids were made. The price crept up slowly, painfully. It stalled at $1,000 an acre, a fraction of the bubble-era appraisals. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, listening. He had come with his checkbook in his pocket. He had done the math, the money he had saved, the nest egg Henderson had once called lazy money, was now the most powerful force in the county. It was real. It was his. He could buy this land. He could take it back. The thought was a sweet, sharp tang of vindication. He watched Dale, who was staring at the ground, unable to watch the dismemberment of his life. Silas saw the shame, the utter defeat, and in that moment, the desire for vindication evaporated, replaced by something else, something deeper. He remembered his father's words, not the ones about the bank, but others. Quieter words spoken in the barn on long winter evenings. The land is a gift. We don't own it. We're just looking after it for a while. Be a good neighbor to the land, and be a good neighbor to the man on the other side of the fence. The auctioneer was calling for a final bid. $1,000 an acre. Do I hear 1,100? 1,000 once, 1,000 twice. Silas raised his hand, not high, just a slight, firm gesture. 1,100, he said, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. The banker, Henderson, looked over, his eyes wide with surprise and relief. The bidding resumed, a little more energetically now. Another farmer bid 1,150. Silas came back immediately with 1,200. It went back and forth, but Silas never hesitated. His bids were calm, immediate, resolute. He knew his number, and he had the cash to back it. $1,400 an acre, he bid finally. Silence. The other bidder shook his head and stepped back. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the silence. "For $1,400 an acre to Silas Blackwood." He didn't stop there. The next parcel up was the 80 acres that included the half-finished house, the barns, and the machine shed. The home place. The bidding was sluggish. No one wanted a farm with a house that needed $50,000 to finish. Silas bought that too, for a price that was almost an insult. When the auction was over, the crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the cold and the gloom. Silas made his way to the trailer to sign the papers and write the checks. As he came out, Dale was waiting for him. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what to say, Si," Dale began, his voice rough. "Congratulations, I guess. You won." "It wasn't a contest, Dale," Silas said quietly. He looked at the house, then back at the younger man. "I've got a proposition for you. That house, it's a good house, solid foundation. It'd be a shame to let it sit empty." Dale stared at him, confused. "I'll make you a deal," Silas continued. "You finish the house. You and your family can live in it. You can farm the home 80. We'll work out a fair crop share lease. Gives you a chance to get back on your feet. No bank. Just you and me." Dale was speechless. He looked at Silas, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The arrogance, the pity, the rivalry, it all melted away, leaving only the raw humanity of two men who loved the same piece of earth. "Why?" Dale finally managed to ask. "After everything, why would you do that?" Silas looked out over the land, the brown, sleeping fields that stretched to the horizon. "Because this county's lost enough good farmers," he said. "It's time we started looking after each other again." In the years that followed, the farm economy slowly healed. The prices recovered, the interest rates came down, and a hard-won stability returned to the land. But the landscape had changed forever. Many of the old family names were gone from the mailboxes, replaced by corporate logos, or the names of the few survivors who had managed to expand. Silas Blackwood became one of those survivors, but not through ruthless expansion. He farmed his newly acquired land with the same care and prudence as he did his own. Dale, humbled and grateful, became a good tenant and, eventually, a good friend. The two men, once symbols of opposing philosophies, found a common ground in their shared love for the soil. Silas never bought a new combine. The old John Deere 95 continued to bring in the harvest year after year. It became a local legend, a faded green symbol of endurance. Farmers would sometimes stop by just to look at it, sitting in the corner of the machine shed, its simple, rugged lines, a rebuke to the complex, debt-fueled machines that had failed so many. As he grew older, Silas passed his knowledge on to his grandson, a young boy with his grandfather's steady eyes. He didn't teach him about futures markets or cash flow projections. He taught him how to listen to an engine, how to feel the soil to know when it was ready to plant, how to fix a broken chain with his own 2 hands. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Silas and the boy were standing on the hill overlooking the farm. Silas was old now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his walk a slow, deliberate shuffle. But his eyes were still sharp. They watched the 95, now driven by Silas's son, making its steady way through a field of golden corn. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why didn't you ever get a new combine? A bigger one?" Silas put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at the neat, debt-free farmstead below, the white house, the red barn, the full grain bins. He looked at the land, his land, stretching out in the warm afternoon sun. "Because that one," he said, his voice a low rumble, "doesn't own a piece of me. We're even. And being even with the world, son, that's the only kind of rich that truly matters." The old combine reached the end of the row, turned, and started back, its engine a familiar, comforting song against the vast, quiet landscape. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of home.